Welcome to the first webinar organized by FAWEC, the Farm Animal Welfare Education Center. We want to thank our sponsor to support this initiative, Boehringer Ingelheim, Castañer and Lucta. This webinar contains 40 minutes of presentation, and after that a little bit of discussion. During and after the webinar, you can send your questions or comments to info@fawec.org. So we can start. The title of this webinar is the feature of the European Union legislation on farm animal welfare, and will be presented by Dr. Xavier Manteca. Dr. Manteca works as a professor in the Universitat Autònoma of Barcelona. So we can start.
Thank you very much, Eva, and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar of the FAWEC, the Farm Animal Welfare Education Center. As Eva just said, the webinar is on the future of the European Union legislation on farm animal welfare, and this is the plan of the talk. I will start by discussing some aspects of the current situation in Europe as regards farm animal welfare. And then I will spend most of my time discussing three aspects which I think will be the main changes in the future. And these are the education of stock people, the risk assessment to deal with farm animal welfare problems, and the use of animal-based indicators to assess welfare. After that, I will spend a few minutes discussing possible changes in specific aspects of the legislation, and I will finish up with a few concluding remarks. So let's get started then with a brief discussion of the current situation in Europe as regards animal welfare in general and farm animal welfare in particular. I think it is fair to say that the European Union has been extremely active in the field of animal welfare over the last decades. A good example of this is the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, which in its Article 13 states that animals are sentient beings, meaning that they are able to experience pain and other forms of suffering. And also, according to this treaty, the European Union policy shall pay full regard to the welfare of animals. It is not only about statements, it's also about facts and money. And for example, over the last few years, the European Union has invested about 70 million euros per year in the field of animal welfare. Now, specifically, in the field of farm animal welfare, this activity, interest of the European Union has translated into several pieces of legislation. And in particular, we have an umbrella directive which covers the welfare of a variety of species in very general terms. And then we have specific directives and regulations. And in particular, we have directives or regulations covering the welfare of animals during transport and at slaughter. And then we have directives setting minimum standards for the protection of animals on farm in the case of laying hens, calves, pigs, and broilers. Now, if you look at this description of the current legislation in Europe as for farm animal welfare, it is very clear that we still have some gaps in the legislation. And one of the most striking, if you wish, is that apart from this umbrella directive, which covers a variety of species and production systems, apart from this umbrella directive, we do not have currently any specific directive covering the welfare of dairy cattle. So why is that? Well, it is likely that one of the reasons behind this fact is that the European citizen, in average, sees dairy production as more welfare-friendly than other forms of livestock production. I am not saying that this is necessarily true. I am saying that this is an impression probably shared by a fair proportion of European citizens. Nevertheless, when we look at the scientific evidence about welfare problems in a variety of species, it appears very clear that some painful conditions, for example, mastitis and lameness in dairy cows, are among the most worrying welfare problems in any farm species. So it seems that we do have a sort of mismatch, if you wish, between the perception of the European citizen and the scientific data or the reality, if you wish. Now, not everything is, of course, positive in this current situation of farm animal welfare in Europe. And I think that we do have a number of problems. And one of them is the lack of compliance with at least some of these directives and regulations. We have good data showing that the level of compliance is far from perfect. And not only that, it also happens that the level of compliance is different between member states. Another general problem is what we may call very plainly a lack of knowledge about animal welfare in general and farm animal welfare in particular by the stakeholders in general, but particularly by the consumers. And I think that this lack of knowledge, this lack of information about farm animal welfare in the consumers has important economic consequences for the European Union. And why is that? Well, now we face a situation in which European farmers have to produce meat, eggs, according to high standards of welfare. And outside the European Union, very often, those standards don't apply, and this may result, at least in some cases, in production costs being higher in Europe than elsewhere. Now, if we don't have any instrument to prevent non-European producers from exporting into the European Union, the only tool we have to protect the European farmers would be that European consumers develop shopping habits according to the level of welfare in the different parts of the world, level of animal welfare. And of course, the problem is that even though a fair proportion of European citizens say that they would be prepared to modify their shopping habits according to the level of animal welfare, the reality is that many of them don't. And one of the reasons why they don't do what they say they would do is that they lack information about the actual level of welfare in different production systems. Now, another general issue that we are facing now in the European Union is that most European Union directives or regulations are based on what we call resource-based indicators. Now, to give you a little bit of background, animal welfare can be assessed using two different types of indicators, animal-based and resource-based. Animal-based indicators would be things, for example, such as body condition, behavior, health status, and so on, whereas resource-based indicators would be things such as pen size, pen design, type of flooring, etc. Now, most European Union directives and regulations, as I said, are based on resource-based indicators. And for the reasons I will explain later on, these sort of indicators may not be the most effective at assessing actual animal welfare. Now, the only exception is the broiler directive, which includes some animal-based indicators to monitor farm performance and farm welfare, and according to that individual farm performance, set the maximum stocking density. But this is the only exception we have, the only piece of European legislation which includes animal-based indicators. And I think it's interesting to emphasize that this broiler directive is the last one that has been approved in Europe, and perhaps the fact that it includes animal-based indicators is a sign of a more general shift towards the use of animal-based indicators in general. Now, basically to address these problems or shortcomings, or try to design a strategy to overcome them, the European Union has approved a strategy for the protection and welfare of the animals for the period between 2012-2015. And what I will do now is to share with you some of the elements which are included in this strategy, because this strategy is basically setting the framework of the most likely changes in the legislation in the near future. And I would like to clarify that even though I will base the rest of my talk largely on this strategy, what I'm going to say does not reflect necessarily the official opinion of the European Commission. So it's basically my view on the most likely changes in the future. So as I said before, I think that we have three elements that will constitute the main changes in the farm animal welfare legislation in Europe for the next few years. And these three elements are the emphasis on the education and training of stock people. That's number one. Second one is the use of a risk analysis or risk assessment approach to deal with farm animal welfare issues. And the third one is the use of animal-based indicators to assess animal welfare. Okay, so let's get started with the first two, the education of stock people and the risk assessment approach. I think that most, if not all, animal welfare scientists agree that the quality of the stock people, the quality of stockmanship, has a dramatic effect on the welfare of animals. And this is for a variety of reasons, but this can be summarized into two main aspects. One is that good stock people are able to prevent, to identify, and treat welfare problems more efficiently than stock people who are not trained. And secondly, the quality of stockmanship reflects on the presence of a chronic fear response in the animals. So let's deal first with this issue of quality of stock people and identification, treatment of welfare problems. And to do that, I have chosen an example which relates to dairy cows, and that is the problem of mastitis. Mastitis are one of the major welfare problems in dairy cattle, and this is because the main reason is that mastitis, all clinical mastitis, even mild clinical mastitis, cause pain. So we don't need to have a severe mastitis to have an animal in pain, a cow in pain. We now have evidence showing that all clinical mastitis may cause pain. This pain may be long-lasting. We have also evidence of hyperalgesia caused by mastitis in dairy cows. And apart from this issue of pain, we have an effect of mastitis on the behavior of the cows, in the sense that dairy cows with mastitis reduce the amount of time they spend resting. And we know that resting behavior, lying behavior, is a priority, a behavior of high priority for dairy cows. So mastitis are important because they cause pain and because they interfere with the resting behavior of dairy cows. Now, it follows then that to improve the welfare of dairy cattle, it would be good to be able to prevent mastitis. But the problem with mastitis is that they are a multifactorial problem. So if we want to prevent them, we should be able not only to identify the risk factors, but also to rank the risk factors so that we could invest our efforts to address the most important risk factors, those that have the largest effect. And here, to identify the risk factors and to rank them is when the risk assessment approach comes into play. And this, increasingly, the use of this risk assessment approach, I think is going to be it is already being one of the main changes in the animal welfare research and policy in Europe. And that is also in part because of the role played by EFSA, the European Food Safety Authority. One of the panels of EFSA is the panel on animal health and animal welfare, which is currently producing reports and opinions on the welfare of farm animals. And EFSA is basically using a risk assessment approach in all the fields of activity, including as well the field of farm animal welfare. Now, EFSA has produced a report on risk factors for mastitis in dairy cattle. And I think is a very interesting example of this, if you wish, more recent approach to deal with farm animal welfare, the risk assessment approach. And basically, what this report by EFSA says about risk factors for mastitis is that first, housing and management are more important than feeding and genetics. Second, within the field of housing, perhaps the most important risk factor is the absence of adequate bedding for the animals. And finally, within the item management, probably the most important risk factors is the absence of a proper treatment and care of the affected animals, of the cows that are suffering mastitis. So now here, thanks to this risk assessment approach, we can identify where we should put our efforts to prevent mastitis. And this is clearly related with the issue of quality of stockmanship. Because if you think about the two main risk factors, so lack of adequate bedding and lack of an adequate treatment and care of affected animals, these are strongly related to the quality of the stock people taking care of the animals. Now, the other reason why the quality of stockmanship is important in farm animal welfare is related to the issue of chronic fear in the animals. We have very compelling evidence showing that to a large extent, differences across farms in performance are due to differences in the fear response of the animals. So to put it another way, we have very often farms which are very similar in terms of genetics, feeding, housing, and health, and yet the performance of these farms are very different. And one of the reasons why these otherwise similar farms may have so different performance is that on some farms, animals are fearful of people, whereas on some other farms, animals are not fearful of people. And we know that chronic fear elicits a stress response, and this response has negative effects on performance. So basically, the chain of events would be as follows. Poor stockmanship would lead to animals being fearful, and this chronic fear would have negative effects on both performance and welfare. Again, training of the stock people is key to prevent animals from developing fear of caretakers. Now, just to give you an example of this, in the project Welfare Quality, which I will explain in a bit more detail later on, in the context of this project, we in France and Spain did an experiment to assess this fear in growing pigs. We use an standardized test to assess this fear or panic reaction in a variety of farms in France and Spain. And as you can see in this graph, with results from roughly 20 farms, approximately half of the farms had either one or several pens of growing pigs in which the animals show evidence of this fear of the stock people, fear of people. Now, I would like to emphasize that we are not at all considering issues of deliberate cruelty to animals or mistreatment of animals. That's not the issue. That's very rare. It doesn't happen. We are considering things much more subtle, if you wish. So stock people who don't have the training or the experience as to how to approach an animal, how to drive an animal, how to handle an animal, and this lack of experience results in animals developing this fear. But again, I like to make this very clear, we are not at all considering issues of cruelty towards animals. Now, these standardized tests to measure fear of animals have been developed not only for pigs, also for other species, such as dairy cows, for example, and are included in the welfare quality protocols, which I will mention later on. And here on this slide, you have an example of this, the fly distance test, whereby the observer, the person who has to assess welfare on a given farm, has a methodology to approach an individual cow at the feeder, and depending on the distance at which the cow withdraws from the observer, we classify the cows into 4 categories, and then provided we have an adequate sample size, we can infer the level of chronic fear in the animals on that particular farm. So in summary then, I think that we are facing here a big change in the European Union approach to animal welfare. One is that having recognized and having evidence that shows that the quality of stockmanship has such a dramatic effect on welfare, the European Union will put a great effort to guarantee higher standards of training and knowledge of people taking care of animals. So education of stock people is going to be a key aspect. And a second aspect, which here I have dealt with in the same point, is that the European Union, through EFSA, will increasingly use a risk assessment approach to identify those factors that have the largest effect on a set of important welfare problems. So if you wish to remember 2 keywords, those would be training of stock people and risk assessment approach. Now, a third issue, a third general issue, is the move towards animal-based indicators. Now, I have already explained that we have roughly 2 different types of animal welfare indicators, the animal-based ones and the resource-based ones. And traditionally, resource-based indicators have been those most commonly used. But now we have good evidence suggesting that animal-based indicators may well be the best to assess the actual welfare of the animals. And I will try to explain that by giving you a couple of examples which relate to pigs and particularly to growing pigs. And one of these examples is stocking density in growing pigs. Now, we know that when stocking density is too high, we may have a variety of welfare problems, including, for example, physical discomfort, thermal discomfort, or a higher risk of tail biting. Now, it is then important to set adequate recommendations about stocking density to guarantee the welfare of growing pigs. Then you could think, okay, let's do that. Shouldn't be that difficult. We decide which is the right stocking density, and then we go and check whether the stocking density on a particular farm is right or wrong. That would be a resource-based approach. And the problem is that for this approach to be successful, we do need to have knowledge about what would be the right stocking density in general. And I'm going to show now with a couple of slides that this decision on what is the right stocking density is far from simple. Now, on this slide here above, you have a pig which is lying in external recumbency. Below, you have the same pig lying on lateral recumbency. Now, if this pig is a 100 kilo pig, so it is at the end of the growing period, so shortly before going to the slaughterhouse, the pig above, lying in external recumbency, would take up roughly 0.4 square meters. The pig below, the very same pig resting in lateral recumbency, would take up roughly 1 square meter. Now, this 0.4 and 1 square meter is not the space the pig needs. It is the space the pig occupies. Now, we know that the amount of space which is needed would be this plus an additional 10%. Okay, so following this brief reasoning, what would be the minimum space allowance for growing pigs? So if the pigs decide to lie in external recumbency, that would be 0.4 plus 10%. If pigs decide to lie in lateral recumbency, that would be 1 plus 10%. Now, if pigs decide to lie in an intermediate position, that would be roughly halfway between both figures. Now, the next question then would be why pigs lie in external recumbency or in lateral recumbency. And as most of you know, the key factor deciding the position, the lying position, is temperature. If pigs are cold, they tend to lie in external recumbency. If they are hot, they tend to lie in lateral recumbency. If they are neither hot nor cold, so if they are in thermoneutral conditions, then they would lie in a lateral or external position, in an intermediate position, or some pigs would lie in one position, some other pigs in the other position. So, but we would have an intermediate situation. Now, in thermoneutral conditions, then, the amount of space needed per pig, a pig of 100 kilos, would be roughly 0.85 square meters. Between brackets, you have the minimum space allowance for that sort of pigs according to the current European legislation. So in thermoneutral conditions, the right space allowance would be 0.85. But of course, that is only in thermoneutral conditions. If animals are cold, they would need less space. If animals are hot, they would need more space. But the problem then is that whether pigs are cold or hot does not depend only on ambient temperature. It depends on what we call effective temperature. And effective temperature will depend on ambient temperature plus ventilation plus flooring. So this basically illustrates that something so simple as the space needed by a particular pig depends not only on the weight of the pig, but also on how the pig decides to lie down. And this, in turn, depends on the ambient temperature, ventilation, and flooring. And on top of all this, minimum space allowance depends also on health status and group size. So in other words, Do we have a simple answer for the question how much space a pig needs? And the answer is no, we don't have a simple answer for that, because it depends on a variety of circumstances. So rather than setting minimum space allowance or maximum stocking densities, it would be much easier to look at the pigs themselves on each particular farm and find out whether we are giving signs of physical or thermal discomfort, because that would be the only way to cover for all the interplay between environmental factors. Now, another example to illustrate why animal-based indicators are so useful is tail biting in pigs. Now, we have good evidence suggesting that tail biting is basically a redirected form of rooting behavior, or a redirected form of exploratory behavior. And the thing is that in natural conditions, pigs would spend a significant amount of their active time rooting. But then, obviously, if a pig wants to root, it needs something which is chewable, soft, and this may not be found if pigs are kept on sludge or concrete. So if pigs still have the drive to root, and they do have it, and they are unable to root at the floor because the floor is sludge or concrete, the pigs will look for an alternative stimulus, and very often the only soft thing that pigs may reach in a growing pig pen is the body of another pig. And that is the starting point of a tail biting outbreak. Now, if this is the case, then you would say, or you may think, okay, fine, very easy. We go onto a farm and look whether there is straw or any other material which may elicit or stimulate rooting activities. But once again, life is more complicated. And here what you have is a result of another experiment done as well in the framework of the Welfare Quality Project. Basically, you may see 3 columns here, and I would like to draw your attention to those on the left, so concrete and straw. And the height of the bar represents the percentage of tail biting animals with tail biting evidences. And as you can see, there is in this particular study no significant effect of the presence of straw. So if here you went along and applied a resource-based approach, you would conclude wrongly that farms with straw would be better off in terms of animal welfare. Whereas the reality here is that those farms, despite the fact that they had the resource, straw, were not better off than those without the straw. The reason for this is that, of course, the effect of straw may depend on the quality of the straw, and also that tail biting is multifactorial. So if it is again so complicated, probably the best approach is not to look at the presence or absence of a straw, apart, of course, from the legal requirements, but to look directly at the animals themselves. And if the animals show evidences of tail biting, then they are telling you that there is a welfare problem on that particular farm. So looking at whether the animals have evidences of tail biting is an animal-based approach, whereas looking at whether the farm has a straw would be a resource-based approach. And of course, in this particular case, we have to look at the presence of rooting material because there is a legal requirement. But to assess welfare, once again, looking directly at the animals is more telling than looking at the environment. Why? Because by looking at the animals, we avoid the problem of interaction between environmental factors, and these animal-based indicators give us more information on the actual welfare status of the animals. The problem, of course, and we can discuss that later on in the discussion session, is that these animal-based indicators may be more difficult to use or at least more time-consuming. Okay, so this move towards the use of animal-based indicators is not something that will happen in the future. It has already started, at least in the area of research, and probably the best example is the Welfare Quality Project, which I have mentioned before. This project of the 6th Framework Program of the European Commission has been one of the largest research projects in the field of animal welfare ever, with a total of 17 countries, 13 from Europe and 4 from Latin America, and more than 40 research institutions all over the place. And one of the main deliverables, and you can get more information about this project on the web, one of the main deliverables of welfare quality have been these assessment protocols. We have one for cattle, welfare assessment protocol for cattle, both dairy and beef, another one for pigs, and another one for chickens, both laying hens and broilers. Now, one of the beauties of these welfare assessment protocols is that they mainly use an animal-based approach. Just for those of you who are not familiar with the welfare quality protocol, and to give you some more background, the starting point of the protocols was the principle of the 5 freedoms, which in its current wording was put forward by the Farm Animal Welfare Council in 1993. In the framework of the welfare quality, we decided to slightly modify this principle of the 5 freedoms and to make it into 4 principles of welfare. One related to feeding, so are the animals properly fed and supplied with water. Another one related to housing, are the animals properly housed. Another one related to health, are the animals healthy? And a last one related to behavior and emotional state of the animals. So does the behavior of the animals reflect an optimized emotional state? So these are the 4 principles of welfare which make the core, the framework of these welfare assessment protocols. And then the idea is that for each of these 4 principles, we have a number of criteria, up to a total of 12, so that, for example, for the principle of good health, we have this criteria of absence of injuries, absence of disease, and absence of pain induced by management practices. For the principle of appropriate behavior, we have 4 criteria: expression of social behavior, expression of other behavior, good human-animal relationship, and positive emotional state. So the framework, once again, 4 principles based on the 5 freedoms of the Farm Animal Welfare Council, and for each of these 4 principles, a number of criteria up to a total number of 12. And then, for each of these 12 criteria, the welfare quality protocols develop a number of indicators. For example, here you have, once again, for cattle, beef cattle in this particular example, good feeding, good housing, good health, appropriate behavior, the 4 principles, then the 12 criteria, and for the criteria absence of prolonged hunger, which pertains to the principle of good feeding, one of the indicators would be body condition. And then what the protocol gives is a lot of detailed information on how to record body condition on a given farm. And this applies to a total of roughly 40 or 50 indicators which cover the 12 criteria of the 4 principles. Now, and finally, what the protocol also includes is a methodology to get an overall assessment, an overall rank of welfare for each particular farm. And of course, the protocols can be used for a variety of purposes. For example, if you want to get this overall score for legislative or labeling purposes, then you have to go through the whole process. Whereas if you want to give advice to the farmer by identifying the main welfare problems, then it is probably enough to look at each of the criteria or principles on its own and decide where the main problems of that particular farm are. Okay, so the third important issue then is this movement towards animal-based indicators. I hope I have convinced you that animal-based indicators are overall better than resource-based indicators, and the two examples with stocking density and tail biting in pigs illustrate the problem of interaction between environmental factors, which is overcome if you use animal-based indicators. And the other important piece of information is that we already know a lot of information, and actually we have developed protocols, the welfare quality protocols, to apply in practice this approach based on animal-based indicators. Okay, so let's move now to the next part of the talk, which is this filling the gaps in the European Union legislation. And I will be very brief here, because if any of you is wondering whether the European Union is in train of developing new directives, so on top of the ones we have, well, probably the most pertinent answer would be to say that new directives are not explicitly mentioned in the strategy, in the Animal Protection and Welfare Strategy 2012-2015. However, under the chapters actions foreseen of this strategy, this is mentioned to possible new initiatives, particularly on pig and fish welfare, on pig welfare and on the welfare of farm fish. And it is likely, perhaps, that there are new initiatives as well on dairy cattle welfare, and if that is the case, then I am pretty convinced that it will be a great emphasis on using, or at least on developing, a set of animal-based measures to assess welfare of dairy cattle. Now, going back to pigs, what are the most likely actions of the European Union in the field of pig welfare? Well, I think that there are basically three issues here. One is that very likely the European Union will enforce actions on the grouping of pregnant sows. Second issue is enforcement actions on the use of enrichment material. As you know, current legislation says that pigs have to have access to rotting material, and tail docking as a routinary practice is banned, but the level of compliance with these issues is extremely diverse among member states. So I think it is very likely that we see strong enforcement actions on the side of the European Union. And perhaps, and only perhaps, it might be that in the future the European Commission decides to address the issue of housing of lactating sows. So far, the European Union, as you all know, has banned stalls for pregnant sows, but farrowing crates are still legal in the European Union and elsewhere. But we know that these farrowing crates, despite the fact that they do have advantages, and traditionally it has been said that they reduce piglet crushing, although not all the evidence coincide on this particular point. But what is very clear is that the farrowing crates do have disadvantages in terms of animal welfare. And the most obvious is that sows which are housed in crates in the period before farrowing have a strong motivation to build a nest, and yet this nest building behavior is not possible if the sow is within the crate. And this impossibility to show the nest building behavior has important welfare and performance consequences. So it might well be, I am not positive about it, but it might well be that in the future the European Union decided to address this issue of housing of lactating sows. Okay, and this brings us to the end of the webinar. And I would like to summarize with these concluding remarks, and I think just to, if you want to have a take-home message, I think you should remember two keywords. One is education. The other one is animal-based measures. And I would like to finish by saying that I strongly believe that this gives us, veterinarians and animal scientists, an extremely good opportunity. Because we have education of stock people, and then the use of animal-based measures. And using animal-based measures also requires training and education. So the summary of all this would basically be training, education, more training, more education. And I think that we as vets and animal scientists, animal welfare scientists, have an important role to play in providing that training to farmers and to other professionals in our area. And that's it from me. Thank you very much for listening. And I guess now that Eva will introduce some of the questions you have sent us. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Xavier Manteca. Yes, here we have some questions. For example, the first one is, you say that animal-based indicators have more merit than resource-based indicators. So the question is, despite of this, do you think that resource-based indicators have some advantages? And in your opinion, are you agree to completely eliminate resource-based indicators in a protocol for assessing animal welfare?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a rather important point. Basically, what I was trying to explain is that traditionally we have been focusing on resource-based indicators. And now we have evidence showing that animal-based indicators may be more telling. They may provide more accurate information on the actual welfare status of the animals. And I think that's true. However, this does not mean that resource-based indicators are useless. I think that they are still very important because I think that to improve animal welfare, you need to follow a two-step approach. So first, you have to assess welfare and to identify problems. But then, you have to suggest and implement improvement strategies. Now, my suggestion would be that for the first step, identifying problems and assessing welfare, animal-based indicators are clearly the best option. But then, once you have identified welfare problems, you need to decide what are the best improvement strategies. And those improvement strategies will depend on the characteristics of the farm, the characteristics of the environment in which animals are kept. In other words, to identify where you have to invest resources, you still need to look at the environment. So in summary, I would suggest that to assess welfare, the emphasis should be placed wherever possible in animal-based indicators. But then you have to go back and look at the environment to identify the best improvement strategies.
And in relation to this discussion, here we have another question and said, do you think that animal-based indicator approach can have some limitations once implemented by the legislation?
Yeah, I think that, if we accept that animal-based indicators are better to assess welfare, and I think they are, then the problem follows that using those indicators is first more time-consuming than looking at resource-based indicators. To put it simply, it is much quicker to measure the size of a pen than to count the percentage of pigs with skin lesions, for example. So you need more time, and that may be a problem. But perhaps more important than that is the fact that measuring the size of a pen is rather obvious. So you don't need very complicated training to do that. Whereas to assess the characteristics of lesions, to assess body condition, to assess behavior, to critically look into health records, you do need a good training on the use of those animal-based measures. So I think that basing legislation on animal-based measures is possible. I think it's the only way to go forward, but that I think is only going to be successful if you have good training programs for those who have to implement the legislation. Because without that training, then looking at those animal-based indicators would not be possible, or at least reliable.
The next one is nesting behavior. You say that nesting behavior have an important impact on animal welfare during the farrowing period, but do you think that nesting behavior have any economic impact?
Well, yeah, I think we have good evidence that if pre-farrowing sows are prevented from performing nest building, then they may mount a stress response, and this stress response may inhibit the release of oxytocin. And if that is the case, then farrowing may be longer than it should be. And we also know that too long a farrowing increases the risk of cerebral hypoxia in piglets, may then lead to weak piglets, and piglets which are more likely to die due to crashing or starvation. So I think that providing a facility which allows nest building has benefits not only in terms of animal welfare, but it may result in a shorter farrowing, because there is no inhibition of oxytocin release, and shorter farrowings are better off in terms of piglet survival.
And here there is a question related to the obligatory education that stock people have to perform at farm level. So home training of stock people will be implemented and follow up, especially concerning to small farm producers?
Yeah, that's a good issue. I think that we'll see this strong emphasis on the need to train the stock people. And of course, this raises a huge amount of questions as to whether who is going to pay for that, what is the best way to convey the information, how the quality of this training will be assessed, and so on. And I am afraid that right now we don't have any concrete answer for these questions. The only thing I can tell you is that very recently several institutes in Europe have started a project which is called EU WellNet, a pilot network of reference centers for animal welfare. This is a project funded by Sanco. And one of the objectives of this project which runs roughly from January the 1st, 2013 to the last day of 2013, so it's 1-year project. One of the main objectives of this project is to explore issues such as what sort of information we have to convey, how can we assess the effectiveness of this information and training, and so on. It's only a pilot exercise, but it is likely to yield interesting data on how to proceed in the future. So I think we still have a lot to learn about it.
Okay, now one question in relation to cattle production. So is there expectation of any focus from the new legislation on dairy cattle or fattening cattle?
Yeah, as I said in the talk, we don't have, as far as I know, any explicit mention in the strategy about new directives for cattle. It is also true, on the other hand, that we have this gap in the current legislation. So, out of the main livestock productions in Europe, we have covered, in terms of legislation, pig production, chicken production, but we have very little, apart from the umbrella directive and the transport and slaughter thing, we have very little on welfare on farm for cattle, and specifically, we have nothing about welfare of dairy cattle. And yet, as I said, there is scientific data showing that dairy cattle has very important and severe welfare problems, such as mastitis, lameness, and so on. So you would think, and I would think that there is a need for some, at least some thinking about animal welfare as applied to dairy cattle in Europe. But again, there is no explicit mention about a new directive covering dairy cattle. On the other hand, we do have several EFSA reports covering this risk assessment approach for welfare of dairy cattle. And if I can imagine a move towards new stuff on dairy cattle welfare in Europe, that would be basically about the use of animal-based measures to assess dairy cattle welfare. But my feeling is that over the next few years, we will see a fundamental effort to increase and even out compliance of the current legislation rather than approving new legislation. That would be my gut feeling, so I am not positive about what is going to happen, but that would be my gut feeling. So more emphasis on increasing compliance of what we already have, less emphasis on developing new directives. And yet, we do have this important gap for dairy cattle, and if the European Union aims to cover it, I think that the main effort is going to be to develop a list of animal-based measures.
Thank you, and now we change the species, that is in relation fish. So in your opinion, which are the principal aspects that a future legislation in fishes will cover?
Yeah, I think, just to set the scene or give a little bit of context, that welfare of farm fish is going to be a major issue in the future in the European Union and in other parts of the world as well in the field of animal welfare. So as to what exactly will be addressed, I think that will depend very much on each species of farm fish. So I would advise anybody interested in the most likely changes in this particular field to look at the reports by EFSA, which are freely available on the website of EFSA, the European Food Safety Authority. And in those reports and opinions, you may get at least a feeling of what are the main areas of concern, which are those more likely to be addressed by future legislation. I think, just to give a small indication, it is my feeling that issues such as slaughter and transport of farm fish would be extremely relevant and likely to be covered by possible future legislation.
Thanks, and now we only have time for one last question. Here there is a little bit reflection, is that legislation in the European Union is given more and more the control responsibility to the producers and companies. As an example, the food hygiene regulation. So the question is, in what degree do you think the legislation bodies will transfer the control of animal welfare on farmers or slaughterhouses for?
Yeah, well, that's a difficult one, really. I think that we have several elements to consider here. One is that the European Union is following this farm to fork or fork to farm approach. So considering also the opinion of all steps in the production chain, all the stakeholders, and particularly the opinion of the consumers as well, not only that of the producers. The other thing is that, of course, the farmers, the producers, have a fundamental role to play, and the emphasis on the need for training of stock people is just an example of that. But that would be the third element. I think that one of the functions of the European Union legislation is to set up minimum standards for the protection of animals. So if I would try to imagine what may happen in the future, I think that the European Union would set these minimum standards, which are to be followed by all farmers. And then it might be that we still have some differentiation on the market depending on the particular target population that the product is addressed to. And this with a strong emphasis once again on training and education of the stock people. So at least to implement that aspect of the likely new legislation, producers and companies will have to play a very active role, because they will obviously have to be involved in this training process. Okay, so I think that's it as for questions, and this is the end then of the webinar. Thank you very much for being with us. And I would like to encourage you to have a look at our website, and in the near future, on that website, you will have news on our next webinar, to which all of you are, of course, kindly invited. So thank you very much once again, and bye-bye now.